Erica Rosenberg.
Is now joining. Now that I've given you that technical orientation, let me turn things over to our moderator today, Jim Levitt, the Director for the Program on Conservation and Innovation at the Harvest Forest.
Good morning, everyone. Let me ask that just while I'm speaking for the next minute or two, everyone who's got their speakerphone on, if you could mute yourself, then we will eliminate the echo that I know
now joining.
We can hear. So please mute your phone as you join. And forgive us for, we're going to have people joining, I think, all day, and that's just going to be part of living on the new frontier. Today we are very excited and honored to have with us two true experts on conservation and climate change generally, and more specifically, the impact on the field of conservation of the pending Waxman-Markey legislation on Capitol Hill. The first is John Kostyack from the National Wildlife Federation, and John will speak with us for about 15 minutes, followed by Jad Daley from the Trust for Public Land. Both of these individuals are based in Washington, D.C., and are literally in daily contact with people on the Hill with regard to this legislation, so they can give us the latest word on what's happening.
Is now joining.
Welcome, Lori, and everyone else who's joined the call. So let me begin, please, by calling on John Kostyack. John, are you there still?
Yes, I am, Jim.
All right. John, if you could tell us why a wildlife federation is interested in climate change legislation, and from there explain a little bit about this bill and why it's so important to the future of conservation in the United States.
Sure, Jim, and thanks for inviting me on the call this morning. I'm very excited to be part of this. Well, the National Wildlife Federation in the past 4 or 5 years completely updated its strategic plan, and we have made confronting global warming the top priority of our organization. And that's based upon the recognition that climate change is the leading threat today to wildlife and ecosystems. And we're going to talk a little bit more, but there's really two major aspects of our program, and that is confronting the ultimate causes of the problem, greenhouse gas pollution, as well as dealing with the inevitable impacts. We are well underway in a major change to the world's ecosystems as a result of climate change, and so we're going to have to grapple with that problem as well. So it's become a big focus of our organization.
Then, John, given that, can you explain a little bit? I know that you and I discussed your comments before. You have quite a bit to tell us about adaptation and sequestration and how that works into the Waxman-Markey context.
Yeah, why don't I start walking through my slides, and if everybody looks on the screen, I'm just going to advance them pretty quickly because I know we want to have as much discussion as possible. I think it's necessary to do a very high altitude review of some of the big ecosystem impacts of climate change, just because it's sort of the premise for a lot of this work. And so going to my second slide, let's see if I make sure I know how to advance it. There we go. You really need to start with the poles when you're thinking about climate change, because that's where the most extreme impacts are being felt. You know, roughly 4 times the average surface temperature increase that's being experienced around the globe is being felt on the poles. And so it's almost a harbinger of what's going to be happening in the rest of the planet as global warming plays out in the coming decades. And as you can see from this picture of declining summer sea ice, we've had dramatic changes across the poles, and particularly the northern latitudes, that are leading to essentially a major reordering and disruption of that ecosystem out there, with the loss of the sea ice along the coast. So many of the wildlife species, including the iconic polar bear, losing their essential habitat. But I guess my larger point here is that virtually every ecosystem across the planet is now experiencing these dramatic changes. And so if you shift down to the temperate zones, I'm just going to give a few examples.
Is now joining.
One of the most visually dramatic examples, of course, is what is happening with our western forest and lodgepole pine ecosystem, which is being devastated by the bark beetle, which is in turn resulting from increased surface temperatures and aridity. I mean, the two biggest stories out west, of course, is the heat and the drought. And some people suggest, by the way, the word drought is a misnomer because the drought implies sort of a cyclical pattern when in fact what is heading our way as a result of climate change is simply increased aridity. These circles to your left you can see are some of the hardest hit areas for old growth trees devastated by the pine beetle. Those bright orange spaces you can see all from millions of acres across the west in the U.S. and Canada. The big fear, of course, is that the beetle infestations will have begun to cross the continental divide in Canada and could potentially head all across North America. I oftentimes discuss the climate change challenge to ecosystems in terms of water, changing precipitation patterns, melting ice, and melting snow. You're probably reading every single day about what's happening with drought in California, dramatic changes, wiping out farms in the Central Valley, major threats to water supply for the cities in the south. And obviously, some people don't see the climate change connection, but all you have to do is look at some of the more modest projections of climate change in the coming decades. Those two slides in the middle and the right, one is the lower range warming we're going to be experiencing this century, and the other to the right is the medium, and both of which suggest a dramatic shrinkage of snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas, the major source of water for California, and obviously for the agriculture that supplies so much of this country. And obviously many fish and wildlife species, a very biodiversity-rich state, many fish and wildlife species are dependent upon that same water, and we have a major challenge to balance the competing needs of ecosystems and cities and agriculture in that state, and then essentially that's a harbinger of what's to come all across the West. The other big story with climate change, in addition to too little water, is too much water. Climate change essentially makes the extremes more dramatic in both directions. So we're certainly seeing lots of existing evidence of increased intensified storms and rainfall events. Hurricane Katrina several years ago obviously is the best known one, but many other examples of intensified storms coming out of the tropics. Increased precipitation events really all across the country. When it rains harder and in shorter duration. The other big story, obviously, is sea level rise. You hear quite a bit about it already, but until you see it on the ground, you really can't appreciate it. I live not that far away from the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, and you can see already the substantial amount of wetland loss. And if you can see these projections of where we're heading this century with that part of our natural heritage, a large part of those coastal wetlands will be underwater. Very productive areas, obviously, in terms of seafood and other important natural resource values. So that's the frame for where we're entering this major climate change debate that's taking place in Congress right now. If you look at how you can address this problem, I alluded to it earlier, oftentimes the debate is so heavily focused on the mitigation challenge, which is the top priority, reducing our greenhouse gas footprint and replacing our traditional modes of fueling our economy with a new clean energy economy based heavily upon conservation and renewables. That is the big focus of the legislation we're going to be talking about, but not the main focus of my talk today, which is the adaptation challenge, which we call safeguarding people and wildlife from the impacts of global warming. As my previous slides alluded to, many of the most serious, dangerous impacts of global warming are already underway and are essentially unavoidable. So we have what are known as cap and trade bills. The one you've heard most about is Waxman-Markey, but the structure is the same for each of them, and it's essentially achieves key reductions in greenhouse gases through what is essentially a regulatory program, a permitting program. Oftentimes you hear the word allowances. Allowances are essentially permits. So if you're familiar with the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, it's the same concept, except for it would cover over 80% of our national economy. And anybody who wants to release greenhouse gas pollution into the environment who's covered by the bill, those 80% of these industries, or 80 plus, essentially would need to come within this permitting regime and obtain these permits. There's two ways permits are handed out. One is they are sold through an auction. The other is they are given out for free. Either way, those allowances or permits have value, because the trade part of the cap and trade means that they are freely tradable in a market, and therefore economists can estimate a value for those allowances. So we're going to be talking a fair amount today about allowance value, the value of those permits. The cap part of the program is absolutely crucial because, first of all, we need to place a significant aggressive cap on global warming pollution in order to address the ultimate cause of the problem. But the cap also determines the allowance value. Every year the cap is lowered in order to achieve these emissions reductions, and as a result of the declining number of permits or allowances available each year, the value of those permits goes up. It's a classic case of supply and demand. And so the amount of dollars available for conservation and other public purposes over the years will be increasing. So if you look at how the emissions reductions are achieved under cap and trade legislation, this price signal, as a result of these the decreasing number of permits available and the increasing cost of getting those permits, the price signal will be sent, essentially making carbon pollution that much more expensive and forcing a shift to low carbon technologies. There's a whole bunch of supplemental measures in the bill to foster this shift to a clean energy economy outside of the cap and trade program. We won't have time to talk about that today, but I just want to emphasize that you can't rely entirely upon the cap and the trade. Jad is going to be focusing on the carbon sequestration aspect of the bill, but that is a really important piece to understand that some estimates suggest that as much as 20% of the solution will come from land-based sequestration through soils and forests, and there's significant provisions in the bill dealing with that. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on dealing with the impacts. Any cap and trade program that we have been working on over the years in Congress, virtually all of them have had a provision to essentially address the challenge of adaptation for natural resources and providing funding through those allowances that we talked about. So let's focus now specifically on the bill that is moving in Congress, has now been approved by the House Energy and Commerce Committee, is slated to go to the House floor before the end of the month. We refer to it as ACES, American Clean Energy and Security Act, also known as HR 2454, and if you want to find it on the internet. The key part I alluded to earlier in the cap and trade scheme is that there's cuts in emissions would result in a 17% reductions from 2005 levels in the next decade or so. And those cuts would continue this program would continue into mid-century. And natural resources adaptation essentially is given a percentage of the allowance value that would be generated from that cap. There also is what is known as an offset program, somebody who's governed by the cap who cannot achieve their reductions by changing the technologies within their own industry have the ability to buy offsets, and that is essentially one of the ways we achieve sequestration that Jad is going to be elaborating on. So getting back to this natural resources adaptation under this bill, we had a goal coming into this Congress of getting 5% of the allowance value for natural resource adaptation. That's essentially what we got in last Congress climate legislation. We didn't quite get there. Right now, for the first decade, we get 1% of the allowance value. It'll gradually increase over time up to 4%, as you can see on the slide. The estimates I have here in terms of how much dollars that would generate each year is based upon some really conservative and quickly thrown together modeling done by the Environmental Protection Agency. And essentially, if you use the EPA modeling, we focus on the first couple decades of the program. We've estimated that it would produce about $1.7 billion a year average. Some new numbers just came out this week from the Congressional Budget Office, known as CBO, that had a higher estimate of the value of these allowances, and roughly 50% higher than EPA's estimate for EPA's average. And so we obviously haven't crunched all the numbers yet, but it potentially means an average of $2.5 billion a year for conservation, natural resources adaptation that would flow out of this bill. So I've been equating natural resources adaptation with conservation, and I haven't really defined the terms yet, so let me attempt to do that now. The key to the whole structure of this natural resources adaptation provision of the bill is to understand that there's many different kinds of adaptation, but the type of adaptation we're talking about, natural resources adaptation, is focused on a very specific goal. It's in the definition in the bill of natural resources adaptation. And to boil it down, it's essentially helping species, habitats, ecosystems, ecological processes survive climate change and the related phenomena, ocean acidification. And so it's a very conservation-focused program. That's not necessarily given around the world. If you look at the adaptation reports and programs that are starting to emerge, a lot of them are very focused on protecting infrastructure or helping people move and migrate in response to the most dramatic climate impacts such as sea level rise. This is the premise of this particular provision of the bill is that we need to protect sort of the foundation of our economy and our natural systems that support people and wildlife by getting at the ecosystem conservation challenge. The other key aspect of the natural resources provisions is that all the spending has to be strategic. The federal government it has to work with states and tribes and other partners in preparing a larger national adaptation strategy, and then each agency that will qualify for money under the bill has to prepare its own plan that feeds into that national strategy. So who are the agencies that would be participating in this program? There's essentially 5 federal agencies as well as 2 types of state agencies and tribes. I'm not going to walk through every single line here, but as you can see, the money is pretty broadly distributed among many agencies with the idea that there are different agencies that have historic leadership roles in different types of ecosystems. There's no attempt to create new conservation programs. Instead, this notion of natural resources adaptation has to now be infused within existing programs. Those existing programs will become the delivery vehicle for these dollars. And so all these agencies are essentially going to have to reinvent conservation within their agencies to get those programs to address the climate change challenge. Believe it or not, Jim, I'm wrapping up because I really did want to have a little time for conversation. So let me wrap up with a thought here that there aren't many opportunities like this that come along in our lifetimes in terms of ability to change the way conservation is practiced. A lot of focus has gone on to the big battle over reducing our carbon footprint, and again, as I alluded to earlier, I think that is the top challenge for society today. But a very close second, and really working hand in hand with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, is to get those who are managing our wildlife, land, and water to address the impacts of climate change. And so this bill provides this opportunity to direct these agencies send these agencies into a new era with the incentive of large-scale dedicated funding. The estimates right now, how much money we'll have to work with, are varying quite a bit, but I would have to say each year we're going to have somewhere in the range of $1 to $6 billion using the combined adaptation and sequestration dollars to direct this kind of conservation work. We will have a fairly detailed directive and agenda given to our federal and state natural resource agencies to essentially create adaptation programs within their existing frameworks, and that will be driven again by large-scale funding. Now, one caveat before I wrap up: we had one little setback, I shouldn't call it little, in the committee process. Not all of the money right now is dedicated in the sense of outside of the appropriations process. The state money, which represents 38.5% of the total dollars, is dedicated, not subject to further mucking around by appropriators.
It is now joining.
But the 61.5% that would go to federal agencies, as of right now, the bill says that the appropriators are going to have to weigh in before the money actually goes out to those agencies. We're quite nervous about that based upon past experience, and we're working as hard as we can to tighten that language up to make sure this is truly preventing any diversion of these funds to non-conservation purposes, so stay tuned on that. But in general, I really want to close to give people the sense that, in the history of conservation work we've done over the decades, you don't see these kinds of dollars available for essentially conserving the nation's biological wealth come along in our lifetimes. And so if you've been involved in the big tariff funding campaign of the 90s or any of the other major efforts to focus our natural resources agencies on conservation of our biological resources, please pay attention here and get involved, because it's a big opportunity.
That's terrific, John, and you're right on time. I appreciate that. We're going to take questions for both John and Jad after Jad's discussion. So the way that you can do that and start getting in the queue to ask questions now is to click on your
John Kostyack.
Question button.
Is now exiting.
John, we've lost John, but my prediction is he'll be back. He probably hung up instead of muted. But we will have questions for both Jad and John at the end, but you can send me questions now, which I will read over the air, and I will put them in the queue as Jad is talking. So, Jad, are you there?
I sure am.
All right.
Maybe John's heard me talking too much lately. He might have decided to sign off and save himself. But,
Let me ask one more time, for anyone who's online right now and listening but not speaking, if you could mute your phone, then that would help the rest of us not hear your office conversations. So, Jad, why don't we start out with you? If you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be doing the work you're doing for the Trust for Public Land on this very important legislation. Then we can jump from that into your slide presentation.
you bet, and thanks for the opportunity to do this. I'm really excited about it. I came to the Trust for Public Land about 1.5 years ago, bringing with me leadership of an entity called the Forest Climate Working Group that I'm going to describe to you in a little bit more detail in a moment. And that was somewhat of a catalyst for the organization, which had been undergoing a multi-year assessment of how it wanted to approach the challenge of climate change. And this new piece of the puzzle, this forest climate work that I engaged the organization in when I came on board, I think helped kind of crystallize and focus some of the thinking that had been ongoing in the organization. And so over the course of the last 1.5 years or so, we've developed a new climate conservation program that has 3 major components. One is an element focused on climate mitigation, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Primarily, how can we use land-based conservation to drive carbon sequestration and address the climate challenge. We also have a climate adaptation initiative, and very consistent with the great work that John's done and that he described for you, thinking about how TPL's conservation work can be refocused and redirected in some areas to be more adaptation specific and address things like conserving large forested watersheds that will help mitigate some of the droughts and other climate impacts that John talked about. And then finally, we have a long organizational history with working in urban areas. And we spent some time thinking about how our work on parks and greenway development could potentially aid a climate response, and came to realize that one of the really driving priorities behind a lot of that work was creating more pedestrian-friendly communities and bike-friendly communities and encouraging denser settlement. And that was sort of something that we'd always been intuitive with striving for. But if you look at some of the new thinking that's coming forward in the transportation bill here in Washington and from other climate experts, it's this idea that we really do need to become a more compact society. We need to be more efficient in the ways that we transport ourselves around the landscape. And so what we decided to do was to refocus some of our efforts in park and greenway development to work with cities like New York City that have developed climate plans and essentially help them implement those climate plans through park and greenway development.
All right, very good, Jad. Can you manipulate this tool to bring your slideshow up and then walk through that for us, please? Jad?
Yeah, you bet. I'm hitting it right now.
There it is. Very good.
So it's oddly enough quite up on my screen yet. This is loading the image here for me. So I mentioned before the Forest Climate Working Group, and in talking to you all today about carbon finance and some of the opportunities to achieve our climate change and conservation objectives through this new legislation, I wanted to actually start by talking a little bit about the Forest Climate Working Group, because I think it really gets to the core of why some of these sequestration activities and carbon finance-oriented conservation projects are really win-win and provide a very interesting opportunity to bring together a lot of different constituencies for a set of common goals that they're all things that we really want to try to accomplish. The Forest Climate Working Group, which I co-chair and helped to found, formed about 1.5 years ago. And you see there on your right a list of the endorsing organizations. And I know it's a little blurry on my screen. Hopefully it's not too blurry on your screen. But if you peruse that list of names, you're going to see some pretty unlikely bedfellows there. You know, we have the nation's largest forest products industry entities. We've got all manner of private landowners, from very, very large private landowners like Plum Creek, which is actually the largest landowner in the country, all the way to the American Forest Foundation, which runs the tree farm system and is the voice for family forest owners. So you have industry, you have private landowners, and then you've got a whole manner of wildlife and conservation groups who share their interest in forests as well. And traditionally, over the last couple of decades, there have been plenty of times when all these people have been together in one place, but a lot of times it's been working on the same issue from different directions. And so what we wanted to do with respect to climate change, and this really came out of some work that we had done to bring these same kinds of interests together around the Farm Bill, was to say, let's start from the beginning and do a Venn diagram and figure out where are common interests in how climate legislation and how carbon sequestration in particular can be a tool for us to advance all of our common interests simultaneously. I seem to have lost the PowerPoint on my screen. Are other people still seeing that?
There it is.
So anyway, this group of organizations spent about a year and a half working together. Maybe I'll just go ahead and advance to the next slide. Perhaps it's not happy with me not moving more quickly. This group of organizations came together and spent about a year of doing facilitated dialogue, really behind closed doors, before we took any policy proposals up to Capitol Hill, to figure out where our common interests lie and to work together on achieving those. And really we found that the core message and the core rallying point for all of these organizations is what you see here on the second slide, which is that U.S. forests, and these are EPA estimates, that U.S. forests alone sequester 10% of the annual carbon emissions in the U.S. And you just imagine if you walked into walked into a conference room on Capitol Hill and announced that you had just developed some new energy-saving technology or some new fuel switching opportunity that was going to reduce America's energy use by 10% and reduce the associated emissions by 10%. People would jump out of their chairs and get very excited. But for some reason, the contribution of forests in this way, and by the way, farms add another 2.5%. So you put forests and farms together, and now you're up to 12.5% of annual U.S. emissions are sequestered by our forests and our farms. And so, the group really realized we have a very substantive and important role to play in advancing, in addressing the climate challenge, and we needed to make sure that climate legislation recognized that existing role. But it actually gets more interesting. I mean, you see two pictures of the smokestacks there, and actually, the top image represents the first 10% that forests sequester, but the EPA estimates you could actually double that to 20% of U.S. emissions with the right management and conservation techniques. And so we felt like, wow, this goes from being a significant contribution to being one of the most important new technology, if you will, or new opportunities to further reduce emissions. And again, if you throw farms into the mix, it goes from 12.5% of current emissions to perhaps reducing 25% of future U.S. emissions. So we really have to take this opportunity seriously.
Jad, let me just jump in for a second. Someone's asked in the background, are they going to be able to get all of these slides? And the answer is yes, but someone in the audience somehow is figured out how to take this new version of live meeting and manipulate the slides. So let me ask everyone who's participating, if you could, please keep your hand off your keyboard for right now, and we will make sure to make all of the slides available to you so that Jad has a little bit easier time going through his presentation. Go ahead, Jad.
Thanks. Much appreciated. So the Forest Mountain Working Group and what I'm going to talk about has developed some policy proposals endorsed by the more than 30 diverse organizations that you saw listed there on the first slide, and we've been advancing those collectively on Capitol Hill. And I think
Chair
really,
Simmons
really
is now exiting.
raising some eyebrows because of the opportunity. When people understand the scale of the emissions reduction opportunity, they get very excited. But the other piece of the story, the one other thing I just want to say about this slide is that that 10% that forests are currently sequestering, that's not a floor. That's simply business as usual right now. That's kind of a current baseline. But we can just as easily go down from 10% as we could double from 10% to 20% reductions from our forest sector. How do we lose that sequestration? Is very simple. Anytime we develop forest land, we both release the carbon that's stored in that forest, and we lose the future sequestration potential. The Forest Service estimates that we're going to develop another 44 million acres of our private forest land between now and 2030. That's 11% of all the private forests in this country that are projected to see increased future development. So this idea that it's both about at least maintaining this current level and ideally increasing it is very real. It's a very serious challenge. And so I think the idea when you say to folks in Congress, hey, we could actually address this much of the climate problem if we take this forward, but we could actually make your job harder. We could actually go backwards in this sector and actually create more emissions that have to be addressed through the green energy economy. That's something that gets people to sit up and take notice. So the question is, how can we maximize that sequestration potential? What is it that's going to get us going upward from that 10% from forests, 2.5% from farms, as opposed to going backwards? And really the answer is pretty simple. It's about creating financial incentives for private landowners who every day have options as to how they're going to manage their land, whether or not they're going to develop their land. We need to create incentives for these people to choose to keep their forests as forests, to keep their farms as working farms, and to manage them well and manage them specifically in ways that are going to maximize carbon opportunities. So now I want to dive into a little bit more depth on, well, what are these incentive opportunities, both that are in Waxman-Markey, the ACES bill as it's currently written, but then I want to talk about a really important one on the next slide that is not included in the current bill and that we think is an essential piece of the puzzle. So I'm guessing that folks on the phone have heard a whole heck of a lot about offsets. Offsets are in some ways pretty controversial, and in fact, you may see a poll question coming around to you at some point as to whether you kind of come into this conversation today with any particular bias for or against offsets, whether you think these things can really work. But there are a couple things you need to know about offsets. The first is that they really offer critical cost containment for how we're going to address climate change. The EPA has done a number of estimates, and there are a lot of different numbers out there about this, but a conservative estimate would be that the total cost of what it's going to take to, for our...
John Kostyack is now joining.
What it's going to take to achieve compliance from what they call covered entities, the utilities and others who are emitting large amounts of carbon pollution and are going to be regulated under this legislation. You could reduce the cost by 30 to 70% with a robust offset program. So this is something that the folks who are soon going to have these emission allowances, they see some real benefit to making these offset work, and we all should be interested in that because it's going to have direct impacts on how much it costs consumers, what the ripple effect is through the economy of moving to a cap and trade system and of regulating carbon. So first off, just pure dollars and cents, offsets are something. If we can get a robust offset program, it's going to minimize the economic costs to our society of regulating carbon pollution. It's going to create new economic opportunities for the landowners who develop these projects. And then, as I'll describe in a moment, it also creates opportunities for us to actually create corresponding environmental co-benefits from these projects that actually make it a real win-win for both the bottom line and for the environment. Just say by way of framing that as I think John might have mentioned, the ACES bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, creates a big opportunity for offsets. To be precise, it allows up to 1 billion domestic metric tons of offsets, which is a huge opportunity. In fact, to put a finer point on it, the EPA doesn't think that we could produce that many offsets in the bill. It thinks that probably we could come closer to about 280 or 300 million offsets, but that's still a very significant opportunity. That would be 5 billion or so, plus or minus, worth of incentive funding to get landowners to produce these emissions reductions and then to therefore receive an offset credit for that they could sell to a covered entity.
Ted, you have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. The last thing I'll say, just in framing, I'll talk briefly about this project, is that the trick with offsets, and this will be also a segue to the next slide, is that they have to be, the emissions reductions that we're crediting have to be real, additional, permanent, and verifiable. Because, of course, if you're giving somebody essentially, an offset is essentially a new and additional emissions allowance on top of what was already accounted for in the scientifically driven cap of total emissions that we've set. And so if you're going to give somebody essentially a new allowance above that cap, which is what an offset creates, you better be sure that the activity that offset credit is attached to really does deliver exactly the amount of emissions reductions that it purports to, and that those emissions reductions are maintained for the same amount of time that the new emissions that you've allowed with the offset credit are going to be in the atmosphere, which is generally about 100 years. So really, offsets will be a wonderful opportunity, but the trick is they're only going to work for projects that meet that real, additional, permanent, and verifiable test, and that's actually a pretty narrow target to hit. So what you see here is an example of a project that definitely will be able to hit that target, and this is one that we have already developed, but it's the kind of project that my organization, the Trust for Public Land, could see doing much more of in the future. We worked with the Tensaw National Wildlife Refuge in Louisiana, which had an interest in acquiring some marginal farmland along what was historically bottomland hardwood forest in the Mississippi Delta. And we acquired, so the way we structured the project is we actually acquired the land and undertook the cost and expense of reforesting that land. And in the process of doing that, created an engine for sequestration that by the end of our total project will have sequestered 3 million tons, 3 million metric tons of carbon in this young bottomland hardwood forest. Then we conveyed the land to the National Wildlife Refuge. So the carbon finance became a pretty key piece of this deal. It helped, the federal government. It meant that the federal government needs to spend less money to acquire this piece of land. It enabled us to be able to manage our side of the transaction, and it's going to create native bottomland hardwood forest, which is going to be great habitat for the wildlife refuge, and it's creating, as I said, 3 million tons of emissions reductions, which is going to be great for climate change. So offsets are an important opportunity, but they're not the only opportunity. And in fact, I think a lot of people started out thinking that offsets were going to be the cake, and that what I want to talk about in closing, supplemental incentives, were going to be the icing for forest landowners and farmers. And I would suggest it may actually end up being closer to the other way around. And so what I mean by a supplemental incentives program is one that takes allowances from the cap-and-trade system, and then sort of like with the natural resources adaptation that John described, uses it to fund programs that can accomplish certain environmental goals. In this case, to fund a carbon incentives program that's not tied to creating new emissions allowances. It's not tied back to polluting entities, but essentially would just function like a traditional USDA incentive program that we could use to work with smaller landowners who can't efficiently develop offset projects, or to incentivize activities that we really know are beneficial for carbon, but are unlikely to be able to measure and monitor and verify with the kind of precision needed for offsets each ton of reduction. And so the question is, well, do we want to just give up on working with smaller landowners and just give up on doing projects like avoided deforestation easements that we know it's good to keep forests as forests, and do conservation easements, but we may not be able to say exactly how many tons of carbon, additional carbon, are sequestered as a result? Well, Supplemental Incentives Program gives us the opportunity to do that by simply taking resources from the cap-and-trade system in the form of allowances, but then putting them into climate-specific purposes that are beyond cap-and-trade. Previous versions of the Waxman-Markey bill have included as much as 5% of allowances, which would be, again, maybe $3 billion or so, or potentially even $4 billion, that could be used for this purpose. And you could imagine how many acres of land you could treat, how many landowners you could work with, how much permanent conservation you could accomplish with, $3 or $4 billion to incentivize this kind of carbon conservation that I'm describing. Unfortunately, the current version of the Waxman-Markey bill does not include any allowances for this purpose in the United States. It does include supplemental carbon incentives for use in international forest projects, but it doesn't include any for similar activities in the United States. So the Forest Climate Working Group and many other folks have been working to ask the folks in Congress to restore the supplemental incentive funding, and we're not at this point realistically targeting 5% of allowances, but we think with even 1 or 2% of allowances, which again, as John said, could be between a range of, let's say, $500 million and $1.5 billion, or potentially even more, you could do a tremendous amount of work to incentivize landowners, smaller landowners especially, to undertake practices that will sequester more carbon. And then you could also divert a significant amount of that money into easement programs like the Forest Legacy Program and the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program that can work with those landowners who are trying to sequester more carbon. They're undertaking these practices. You could work with them to say, well, would you be willing to even go a step further and put a permanent conservation easement on this property so that we know that the kind of carbon gains that you're creating now won't just be reversed at some point in the future if you decide to sell and convert your land. So in closing, I'll just say, actually today, there will be a new piece of legislation introduced by Congresswoman Pingree of Maine and Congressman Schuler of North Carolina. It is the Buy American Supplemental Carbon Incentives Bill. The point of this bill is essentially to reinforce that we really do need these supplemental incentives. It proposes a very specific way for what this USDA supplemental incentives program would look like and how we would identify the correct practices for landowners to undertake and how we would compensate them and how the permanent easement funding would factor into all of that. But I think the bill has gotten a lot of support and a lot of attention from members of Congress who recognize that they've got a full range of landowners in their home districts and states who want to contribute to sequestering more carbon. They want to gain additional streams of economic revenues from their land, and that the Supplemental Incentives Program can be a really critical piece of keeping our forests as forests, keeping our forest and farm owners whole, and helping us get to that goal of maybe 20 or 25% of our annual carbon emissions being sequestered by farms and forests instead of just the 12.5% that we're at right now. Thanks so much.
Very, very good, very helpful, quite detailed. So John, I think you're back on.
I am.
John Kostyack and Jad Daley. So the way we'll manage this, and I think we'll probably go past the 11 o'clock Eastern time limit because we're on the internet and we have that kind of flexibility. But we've got some wonderful questions in the queue. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but let me say that if I don't get to your question today, I believe that both of our speakers would be happy to take any question that you've got of them by internet. Is that, John and Jad, is that all right?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So they're just so you know, their email addresses would be jad.daley, D-A-L-E-Y, @tpl.org, and Kostyack, Kostyack, @nwf.org. So I will try to pass along as many questions as I can in the next 20 or 30 minutes, and then anything that you don't get answered, please go directly to the speakers. The first question I'm going to pose to you two gentlemen comes from Gary Tabor, who I believe is somewhere in the Intermountain West right now. And Gary asks one of the big questions, which is that Waxman-Markey, or ACES, or whatever we want to call it today, is one thing. So what are the chances that all of this will hold up in the Senate?
Well, this is John, and Gary, great question. I have to say that the people in the House who have dropped everything and poured heart and soul into this effort in the past half a year would not have done so if they thought this was a hypothetical exercise just designed to get a bill passed out of the House. I think we're talking about Mr. Waxman, Speaker Pelosi, Mr. Dingell, all these people who are making this a top priority for this Congress. Have done so only after getting the assurances from the Senate leadership as well as from President Obama that this is a priority for them as well and that they're going to work to make this happen. Obviously, the Senate, with its requirement for 60 votes to get legislation out, does pose some pretty steep hurdles, but there's a pretty firm commitment to getting this done. The general perception is that the House Energy and Commerce Committee that just passed the ACES is pretty reflective of sort of the broad interests that care about climate change legislation. In other words, it's not perceived as sort of an environmentalist committee by any stretch. The coal sector and the oil and gas sector are well represented. Many other interests that potentially could become stumbling blocks for getting climate change legislation have already had their opportunity to weigh in and have gotten some key provisions in there, essentially the compromise that might reflect the overall balance in Congress. And who knows, it could play out somewhat differently in the Senate, but we're optimistic we can get this done this Congress.
Chad, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just echo that, and I would say if you want a barometer of how serious the situation is with climate change and how much the science is consolidating and confirming what we've long suspected, all you need to do is come to Washington, D.C. and walk around the halls of Congress for a couple of days, because these folks know we need to do this, and we need to do it now. And I think that certainly there's still some political game playing that's going on, but underneath it is, I think, a growing realization across Congress that we really do need to deal with this now, and it's really just, as John was saying, a matter of how the final bill is going to accommodate all of the interest groups and find that fine-tuned balance to get us through. But I feel very confident that something is going to happen, if not this calendar year, early in next year.
Great. All right, so I will jump to a question from Lisa Vernegard in Massachusetts, who asked a more technical question, which is, what is the mechanism for ensuring permanence on private lands, especially given turnover of ownership? Is this effectively a new restriction or easement on the property?
Jad,
yeah, I want to go ahead and take that one. That's a really, really great question. And in fact, it's an example of one of the kinds of details that will be resolved in the rulemaking process that's going to follow the legislative process. One of the debates back and forth on climate change legislation for a long time is how specific should the bill be about those kinds of nuances. Just imagine the scale of managing a cap-and-trade system. With billions of allowances and offsets flying around, we're talking about an undertaking of almost unfathomable complexity in some ways. And the legislation, I think probably smartly, doesn't try to spell out exactly how it's going to deal with all those kinds of things, but suffice it to say, is very likely that the EPA will have some type of regulatory oversight authority so that landowners who enter into an offset, who gain offset credits, and effectively that's a contractual obligation that landowner is undertaking, and that will travel with that land as if it were the land were to be converted, is going to be enforced by EPA. Now, one caveat to note is that there are opportunities for landowners to essentially affect an intentional reversal, if you will, by converting land or by reversing the practice that they agreed to undertake before that 100-year permanence has been achieved. But the key thing is that the legislation is specific on the point that if a landowner were to do that, the landowner is obligated to replace those credits from a bonus pool, and so therefore you really can't economically profit from doing that, and the atmosphere will be made whole in the event that someone were to reverse the carbon that were stored in land before the 100-year permanent time frame has been achieved.
Okay. I'm going to take another question from Abe Doherty in California, I believe. He asked, the state of California is interested in developing a carbon offset protocol for tidal wetlands and managed freshwater wetlands, which have high sequestration rates. What is happening on the federal level for evaluating wetlands as an offset category?
I'll take that one as well, and it's a great question. Wetlands have started to pop up in project lists. It's really important to note, I think I referenced this very briefly, but one of the details on which the legislation right now is very vague is exactly what project types will be eligible, what kinds of farm practices, what types of forest activities, and the question of whether other natural areas that sequester carbon like wetlands will be included. So question number one, will wetland practices even be eligible at all, is unresolved in the current legislation, and exactly what practices or management of wetlands would be seen as additional and therefore qualified for an offset is really even a whole other question that I personally have not seen anything definitive on, but I think that would be one of the greatest challenges there. given that we don't tend to think of wetlands. We tend to think of conserving wetlands as having value, but don't tend to think of them in terms of active management quite as much, where you could imagine those kind of creating those carbon gains through management.
John, do you want to add to that?
Well, it is important to understand the distinction that Jad just made, which is that right now there's no funding mechanism in the bill for any sort of avoided damage to carbon stores in the U.S. And so the offset program that Jad has primarily been focusing on really is for active management above a certain existing environmental baseline. And so unless we can demonstrate that some kind of wetlands restoration is going to improve the carbon value, I have to say I'm a little bit pessimistic that that could be a significant part of the program.
And if I could just quickly, John, to hit the nail right on the head, and if I could just layer finally on top of that, that is yet another example of why a supplemental incentives program, or even programs, layering, for example, into a wetlands reserve program, a carbon component, and then putting some allowance value into funding that, is a really critical way to complement what we can do through offsets, because offsets alone, for the reasons John was describing that I've described, are just necessarily going to miss great carbon sequestration opportunities that we might otherwise lose, or worse yet, even reverse.
Okay, I have a question now from Andrew Zwack. Andrew, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. That's a little bit more oriented towards the finance end of this. Will there be any match requirements for funds directed through the states?
I assume you're alluding to the adaptation program, because the offsets program doesn't really go through the states. And the answer is this is very good news for people who are concerned about the state's ability to participate in this. There is an explicit statement that the federal dollars that will flow to the states will be capped at a 10% match requirement. And the reason behind that is if you look at state budgets today, their ability to participate in this massive ramp-up of a national adaptation program would be very constrained by the traditional match requirements, say 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. And so Congress, at least at this moment, is recognizing that and lowering the match requirements significantly to
Barry Tuckerman and Lisa Bay
is now exiting.
Sorry about that.
Do I need to repeat the end of that, or did everybody get that?
I think we heard it. And again, if anybody needs any further detail, Kostyack at nwf.org. So I now take a question from Becca Brook, who asks, how do forest projects that are on the CCS or that hold another accredited carbon standard transfer, or that hold another accredited carbon standard, how do they transfer into the federal system proposed by ACES?
Well, we're getting some really good questions, and that's a really, really important issue. That issue has generally been categorized as the early action question, and if you looked at the bill as it went into committee markup a couple of weeks ago, it would not have allowed.
Is now exiting.
It would not have allowed credits that were generated by projects under the Chicago Climate Exchange
or now exiting,
or other voluntary standards like the VCS and some of the other voluntary markets out there. They would have been excluded into the bill from the cap and trade system as it went into the committee from offsets markets. However, there were a lot of folks on the Energy and Commerce Committee who recognized that there's been some really good work done developing very important carbon projects through these voluntary markets, and that there ought to be an opportunity for some of their credits going forward, and that the trigger date going forward is 2009. So, for example, like our project that was developed under the Chicago Climate Exchange, that afforestation project in Louisiana that I mentioned, credits generated by that project after 2009 would be eligible to be brought into the federal system and made into a federal offset credit, pending a certain review and meeting certain standards as set up by the bill. There's a lot more detail I could go into. Suffice this, one thing I'll just mention is that That opportunity is now real, and the same is true, by the way, for the California Climate Registry and for the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But the opportunity for these early action programs to be credited as federal offsets is time limited. So it expires at either 3 years after enactment or at the time the federal offset markets are established. And we actually think that there ought to be a little bit more time period for those good projects already in the works to gain credit.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question and then close it off at the hour, because due to the way that the new version of Microsoft Office Live Meeting is working, whenever people sign off, and I know a lot of people have to sign off at the hour, we're hearing it. So let me ask the final question, and then we will post all of this for everybody to review and try to learn more about as time goes on. So the question I want to leave the two of you with is, what can the 60-plus people online today and the several hundred more who are probably going to access this as a podcast, what can they do to impact what's going on in Capitol Hill?
This is John. Let me take a first crack of it. We all need to sort of step away from our policy wonk inclinations and to communicate with our political leadership as well as the broader public about the urgency of just confronting the climate change challenge and passing this legislation. I don't think there's sufficient noise out there right now, considering the gravity of the threat that climate change poses to us right now. And so as leaders in the conservation world, we have an obligation to go beyond speaking to our own choir and to get out and talk to broader audiences and help people understand why this is such an urgent challenge, and why it would, it's actually good for our economy to make this transition, both in terms of promoting clean energy technology as well as promoting the better stewardship of our ecosystems. There's huge opportunities here for stewarding our ecosystem for both people and wildlife, buffering people from the intensified storms associated with climate change, using natural filtration the ecosystems provide in order to address the massive decline of fresh water supplies we're going to be seeing. The list goes on, and we need to help people understand all those incredible benefits to people as well as wildlife that will come out of passing climate change legislation.
Jad, do you want to add to that before we close?
Yeah, John gave such an eloquent answer that he gave me opportunity to get to a couple other points. I agree with everything that John said, and let me just be a little bit self-serving in my answer, which is that, as I began my presentation by saying forests are right now, and forests and farms together, right now 10 to 12.5% of the solution, and could be 25% of the solution. And yet there's, for some strange reason, it's almost like the land-based side of the equation has been a little bit of a blind spot for Congress, and whether you're talking about offsets or whether you're talking about permanent conservation, and I saw the poll on permanent conservation. I think people seem to feel that as an important piece of the puzzle. So to the degree that folks out in the field can continue to raise these questions and ask these questions, where do our forests fit into this equation? Where do our farms fit into this equation? There's been such a heavy emphasis on the green energy economy, which is, of course, really important and incredibly legitimate, that it just sometimes overshadows the role that land conservation and management can also play in this equation. And so I think to the degree that folks in the field can be asking these questions of their members of Congress and suggesting that it's an issue of importance that they ought to be looking at carefully, that really strengthens the hands of all of us who are working on this issue.
Well, I want to close by referring to a poll question that has been racking up some votes just in the last minute or two. Is permanently conserving farm and forest land to protect carbon storage and sequestration potential a legitimate use of revenues from a cap-and-trade system? And you have 24 yes votes, 3 maybe votes, and 0 no votes. So at least from the audience that you're listening to, I think you all have, or that is listening to you, excuse me, you have support. Hopefully consensus is building on Capitol Hill as well, and I want to thank both John and Jad for participating today, and the audience for joining us and asking such extremely well-informed questions. So we will be back with another internet broadcast in September. I hope you all have a very productive summer, and maybe we have some new legislation by the end of the summer that changes the face of conservation. So with that, thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim Levitt and Company.
Is now exiting.
Laurie Kenheiser.
Is now exiting.
Molly Morrison.
Is now exiting.
Laura.
Is now exiting.
Jad Daley.
Is now exiting.
John Kostyack.
Is now exiting.
Chris Roberts.
Is now exiting.
Emily Russell.
Is now exiting.
Lisa Vernegarden.
Is now exiting.
Everything's set. The only thing that I need to find out is I'm sure there's a way to turn that announcement off. And I was looking through this.
Brett Brownscombe.
Is now exiting.
But anyway, it was a really good session again. Yeah, we really appreciate the help. And thanks for saying, I'm having a choice. You know, why would I panic? What could just happen? Yeah, it was great. Great. One more brick in the wall for summer vacation is closing. Excellent. So Matt, what did you think? That was good. You learn anything? I did. I mean, I had like 8 questions. But
Jim Coney recording.
Is now exiting. The leader has disconnected. This call will now end.